In the winter of 1937, something happened in the English countryside that has never been explained. A school closed its gates. The community vanished. And time, for a brief moment, appeared to unravel. A faded photograph fades in. A stone building surrounded by fog. Students in uniform. The caption, Elmsbrook Seminary, 1936. What happened at Elmsbrook Seminary is not widely known. And that is not accidental. The files were sealed. Witnesses silenced. Structures razed. The only surviving trace of its final year is a torn diary. A yearbook with no photographs. And the recurring phrase, the 13th Lesson. It was a place born of discipline and prayer, nestled deep within the moors of Devonshire. Its stone walls older than the country it served. Elmsbrook Seminary had long been a boarding school for the sons of England's minor gentry, a training ground for young men destined for clerical life. The Trinitine Fathers who ran the school claimed a tradition going back to the 17th century. And until 1937, there was no reason to doubt them. In appearance, Elmsbrook was picturesque. Ivy-covered walls, ornate stained-glass windows, a chapel with a spire that pierced the fog like a finger of judgment. But those who lived within its walls knew another side. Coldness, not just from the stone, but in the silence of its halls, in the precise rituals demanded by the fathers. Latin recitations before dawn, chores measured by bell chimes, meals in silence beneath paintings of martyrdom. Locals in the nearby village of Brerecombe rarely spoke of the school. They claimed it was just another religious place, stern but good-hearted. But when deliveries were late or sheep went missing, suspicion always returned to the hill where Elmsbrook stood. Several stories from villagers paint a more uneasy picture. One speaks of a girl who wandered too close and claimed she saw boys standing in the field, staring into the fog. Another of a vicar who said the ground around the school had been blessed too many times, as though the stones themselves were resisting. Enrollment at Elmsbrook had been declining in the early 1930s. In 1936, it received a new headmaster, Father Marcus Giddings, a former theologian from Cambridge who published obscure texts on transcendental catechism. Under his leadership, the school revised its curriculum. Students were introduced to new forms of religious philosophy, including something Giddings called the path of inner geometry. This path involved meditative drawings, the study of sacred ratios, and hours spent walking the labyrinth carved into the old cloister floor. One former student, who transferred before the final year, described it as mathematics designed to make you forget what a square was. The school's chapel, always a center for spiritual life, took on a different tone under Giddings. Hymns were rewritten in minor keys. Services began including silent readings, where students sat unmoving for up to 45 minutes. One student reportedly fainted during a winter service and was not seen again. None of this was reported to the ministry. The Trinitine Fathers were not under the same scrutiny as public institutions. They answered only to their own archdiocese and to God. By the spring of 1937, only 37 students remained at Elmsbrook, along with 8 instructors. All were present at the start of term. None would be accounted for by year's end. The seminary's gates would close for the last time on December 1, 1937.
No formal announcement.
No news coverage. Just a brief legal notice. Elmsbrook Seminary hereby ceases operation. But traces remained. The stone walls did not crumble immediately. Letters were sent. Items left behind. And deep within the school, beyond a rusted door beneath the eastern transept, something burned. The Ministry of Education's file on Elmsbrook Seminary is thin. Just 27 pages, most of them administrative records. The official explanation for the school's closure is budgetary strain and declining enrollment. No mention is made of the disappearance of the 45 individuals listed as present in 1937. Nor is there any record of an investigation. Requests for more information from the Diocese of Exeter were met with silence until 1978, when a Freedom of Information request compelled the release of internal correspondence. These letters, exchanged between diocesan officials and the Trinitine Order, reference an internal schism, and the withdrawal of recognition. One memo includes a troubling line. There are practices at Elmsbrook which do not align with the teachings of the Church or the health of the soul. No criminal charges were ever filed. No missing persons reports accepted. Most of the families involved were either estranged, deceased, or reluctant to speak. Only 2 parents ever gave public interviews, both in 1954, for a short-lived documentary series that aired once before being pulled from broadcast. The footage has never resurfaced, though a transcript remains. In it, one father says, "My son sent a letter in October, said they were studying something called the living word without end. I don't know what it meant, but he said it made his teeth hurt when he listened to the readings." Other oddities exist in peripheral records. In early 1938, land surveyors noted damage to the earth around Elmsbrook, sinkholes forming in patterns too symmetrical to be natural. One report includes the phrase, "like the imprint of a giant compass." Photographs of the school taken in 1937 have also vanished. The only surviving image comes from a local newspaper article printed in January of that year. It shows a class of students and faculty standing outside the main hall, but their faces are blurred, not scratched out or obscured, just unfocused as though the camera lens could not fix them. The photographer Agnes Peel was later interviewed about the photo. She said, "They were all looking at me, but I swear none of them were there when I developed the film." The building itself was sold in 1940, repurposed briefly as a munitions storage depot during the war. A fire in 1943 gutted most of the upper levels. No bodies were found, no records saved. By 1950, all that remained were ruins and silence. The official story had done its job, neatly typed, efficiently filed. But that silence has always been fragile, because underneath the blankness of bureaucracy, the story of Elmsbrook still hums, like a note held too long, waiting for resolution. The dead year. What happened at Elmsbrook Seminary in 1937 ***. In early 1938, a package arrived anonymously at the offices of the diocese archives in Bath. It contained only one item, the 1937 Elmsbrook Seminary Yearbook. The archivist who received it noted several irregularities. There was no return address. The postage was dated from December 1937, and the pages inside were wrong. At first glance, it appears to be a standard yearbook. Handbound, heavy leather cover embossed with a sigil, a trinity not interwoven with a spiral. Below it, the words, Annus Obscura, 1937, the year of darkness. Inside, the layout is conventional sections for staff, for students by form, for clubs and societies and chapel events. But the photographs, dozens of them, are all the same, faces blurred. Every single portrait, from students to instructors, has either been scratched out, overexposed, or faded into blankness. In some cases, you can tell there were faces once. Outlines remain, as if the images were selectively bleached. And it's not simply damage. Photo experts who examined the book in the 1980s agreed. The alterations occurred during development, not afterward. It was as if whoever developed the negatives had done so improperly, or deliberately. There's a section for the chapel choir. 20 names listed.
No faces.
A caption reads, "In voice, the divine descends. In harmony, we ascend." The list of hymns includes one entry not found in any hymnological catalog, Cantus 13. In the sports section, an image shows a football pitch, but all the players are captured mid-turn, their backs to the camera. The result is eerie, as though they were fleeing something, or refusing to be seen. One of the more disturbing spreads is the dormitory page. It shows each room in Elmsbrook's east wing. Bunk beds, study desks, personal effects. But in room 12, the photograph is entirely black. Not faded, just black ink. A handwritten note in the margin says, "Room condemned after incident, March 14th. There is no record of that incident anywhere else in the book. The staff section lists Father Giddings at the top, but his title is not headmaster. Instead, it reads, precentor, an old ecclesiastical term for the lead cantor or liturgical singer. Below him are the rest of the faculty, each assigned not to academic roles, but ritual titles: lector, corrector, illuminator, sacristan. The margins of the book contain annotations, written in pencil, likely by a student. Some pages are marked with spirals, others with Roman numerals that don't correspond to the content. The final page, normally reserved for class signatures, contains only a single phrase repeated 5 times. There were 37. Archivists tried to trace the names in the book to living family members, but nearly every surname is uncommon, and no birth records align precisely. It's as if the student list was fabricated, or that the boys listed lived only within the confines of Elmsbrook. An investigation by historian Dr. Raymond Holloway concluded that the book was never meant to leave the school. It may have been produced not as a memento, but as a ritual artifact, something symbolic, designed to document not memory, but erasure. When scanned digitally, the book exhibits another anomaly. Hidden within the page noise are subvisible glyphs, geometric impressions arranged in a pattern that repeats every 13 pages. Using UV light and thermal scanning, researchers identified these as rotational symbols resembling sacred geometry found in Byzantine altar scripts. One particularly strange finding: if you remove every 13th page from the book and rebind the remainder, a hidden passage emerges in the margins, a Latin hymn known as the Gradual Tenebris, or Steps into Darkness. Whether intentional or emergent, the Yearbook of 1937 functions not as a record of a school year, but as a map of something else. Something buried. Something that required faces to vanish, rooms to blacken, and songs to fold themselves into silence. To this day, it remains one of the few physical relics from Elmsbrook's final term. It now resides in a private collection in Wales. The owner has refused to allow high-resolution scans. When asked why, he simply replied, "Some things blur for a reason." The phrase first appears in the margins of a student's Bible, discovered decades later in a box of unclaimed personal items. The 13th lesson is given only once, and only to those who have already learned it. It was written in Latin, Lectio 30 Semildator, et solis ca iam didiscerent. By the time investigators attempted to piece together what the 13th lesson referred to, nearly all institutional knowledge of Elmsbrook's inner curriculum had vanished. But from fragments recovered, notes, lesson plans, and a single partial timetable, a pattern emerged. Students at Elmsbrook followed a strict weekly schedule. 12 lessons, 1 for each canonical hour, rotated across 6 days. Sundays were reserved for worship. But one chart, drawn hastily on the back of a chapel seating plan, contained a 13th slot. No hour, no subject, just a symbol, an equilateral triangle circumscribed by a spiral, the same motif found on the yearbook cover. Its placement was ambiguous, hovering between the hours of dusk and dawn. Former student Graham Ilsley, who transferred in early 1937 but was expelled before term's end, recalled rumors of a secret midnight class. Only the silent ones went. He wrote in a 1963 letter to a folklorist, "The ones who stopped speaking during meals, the ones who stopped blinking." According to Ilsley, these students were marked, chosen, not for their intelligence or piety, but for their receptiveness. Those who could hold still long enough to let the lesson in. He claimed their eyes looked different after, not vacant, but focused on something beyond the room. The classroom associated with this 13th lesson remains unidentified. The east wing of Elmsbrook had 12 known classrooms, but one fire inspection map, filed in 1935, shows a 13th room tucked behind the vestry, labeled only with the Roman numeral 13. When the ruins of Elmsbrook were surveyed in the 1990s, this room had no corresponding location. It had been bricked up or erased entirely. A salvaged faculty logbook, partially burned, contains a cryptic entry dated October 6, 1937.
13ª lectio completa.
Giddings led. 13 seated. 1 silent throughout. Initiation presumed successful. Symmetry maintained. The handwriting is different from the usual entries, angular as if written with a trembling hand. The term symmetry maintained appears again in marginalia throughout the hymnal collection and in chalk near the chapel's apse. The lesson itself, if it was ever documented, has not survived. But its effects are implied in Simon Bray's diary, see Chapter 6. He refers to waking up in strange positions, kneeling, arms folded geometrically across his chest, with no memory of having moved. Other students were found standing in the hallway, eyes closed, humming tones no one recognized. One account, preserved in the recollections of a groundskeeper's granddaughter, tells of a night when the chapel lights were seen on from the village. She described it as wrong light, neither candle nor electric, like the moon had been folded and brought inside. In a recovered student essay, partially torn and unsigned, a passage reads, "The 13th lesson is not heard. It is not spoken. It is received in stillness, when the breath ceases, and time holds its breath with you." Some believe it was an experiment, a theological exercise taken too far, combining sacred geometry with trance states and meditative deprivation. Others claim it was older, imported from apocryphal orders that predated Christianity. Father Giddings' own writings suggest a belief in a hidden doctrine, a pattern beneath Scripture accessible only through structured silence. In a surviving draft of his unpublished treatise, Silence Ratio, he writes, "True comprehension is the absence of voice. When the mind ceases to pursue, it is pursued. Revelation does not arrive. It unfolds." One particularly troubling report from the Diocesan Inquiry notes that 3 desks in one classroom were found with geometric carvings, spirals within triangles with 13 notches on each side. Beneath one desk was inscribed the phrase, "Descendo illuminabimer," "Through learning we shall be lit." Students who took the 13th lesson did not return home. None were among the names submitted to families or listed in the closure notice. Their belongings remained, but their beds were stripped, their lockers empty. Their final assignments were never graded. The chapel bell, which traditionally rang 12 times for the hours, was reportedly heard ringing 13 times on the night of November 30th, 1937, the last time anyone saw Elmsbrook Seminary occupied. Since then, stories have persisted, of dreams shared by people who never knew each other, of a lesson given in silence, in a room that doesn't exist, of a door that opens only once, and only to those who already know what's on the other side. Whatever the 13th lesson was, it marked a threshold, and those who crossed it left more than the seminary behind. They left time, self, and history, and became part of something else, something symmetrical, something silent, something that waits, still, in the folds of forgotten places. The last confirmed act of Elmsbrook Seminary, before its sudden and permanent closure, was the destruction of its hymnals. They were not discarded, donated, or lost to time through benign neglect. They were intentionally burned, and not just once. In the cellars beneath the chapel, investigators discovered 3 distinct ash pits, each containing layers of scorched parchment and leather bindings. One pit appeared to have been used for kindling, the paper twisted and blackened but still legible in some places. Another had deeper, more sustained heat damage, binding glue melted and fused with the char. But it was the 3rd pit that drew the most attention. This final pit contained what looked like the remains of only one book, burned so thoroughly it had transformed into a brittle sculpture of carbon and ash. It rested alone, on a platform of bricks, surrounded by candle wax and the melted remnants of what appeared to be a ceremonial censer. Carbon dating and analysis of the surviving particles confirmed the book had once been bound in goatskin vellum, with pages of heavy rag paper inked in iron gall. These are materials typically reserved for sacred or secret texts, the kind not shared with students and certainly not left to rot in a cellar. But what was burned? What was being erased? Among the debris from the first ash pit, a single hymn fragment survived, charred around the edges but intact in the center. Its title, Cantus 13, does not appear in any known Anglican or Catholic hymnal. The music was transcribed in an archaic neume notation, resembling the plain song of the early medieval church. But the lyrics were in no known language. Experts brought in to decode the text found that it bore structural similarities to Enochian, the so-called angelic language, invented by Dr. John D. and Edward Kelly in the late 1500s. Yet certain glyphs deviated. The syntax folded back on itself. One linguist said it read, as if the words were designed to be sung not to the divine, but by the divine. A former seminarian, who requested anonymity, recalled being punished for humming a strange melody in the halls. They said I was repeating the 13th canticle, but I had never heard it before. It was just in my head. One musicologist, Dr. Tessa Allwright, described the surviving notation as symmetrical in terror. Each note mirrored across a central axis, as if the melody played forward and backward simultaneously. When a MIDI version was synthesized, listeners reported nausea, vivid dreams, and a sense of being watched. One technician claimed the spectrogram formed a spiral, the same spiral seen etched into the chapel's floor and repeated in student drawings. Why burn such a hymn? The simplest explanation is heresy. The diocese's report from 1939 describes the material found in the ash pits as unsound in doctrine, unsettling in tone, and improper for ecclesiastical study. But this phrasing is tame compared to notes from a second, internal investigation conducted by the Order of St. Irenaeus, a little-known doctrinal watchdog group. Their confidential report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, included the phrase, Canticum tertium decimum, suspected of auditory recursion, inciting lucid sleepwalk, exposure to fourth-order geometries, and temporal dissonance. One line was circled, not a hymn, but a key. The burning, then, was not simply destruction. It was containment. But burning something does not guarantee its silence. The groundskeeper's grandson, who later became an archivist, noted that even decades later, the cellar still smelled of incense and smoke. Visitors reported hearing faint, melodic chanting in the lower chapel, especially near dusk. Recordings made during these visits failed to capture any sound, though spectrograms showed faint disruptions, like inaudible pulses. A local woman, now in her 80s, recalled visiting the ruins as a child. We dared each other to go inside. I remember the burn smell, yes, but I remember music too, not from outside, from underneath. The nature of Cantus 13 remains a mystery. Some believe it was the 13th lesson itself disguised as a hymn. Others say it was an offering, a signal sent into unknown dimensions, meant to summon or synchronize rather than praise. What is certain is that someone at Elmsbrook knew it was dangerous. That someone or several someones decided it had to be purged. And yet the hymn survives. In dreams. In notes sung by the wind through broken windows. In the rhythmic drip of rain into the chapel's collapsed nave. The silence left behind was not empty, but charged. And perhaps the hymn was not destroyed, but merely displaced, waiting not to be sung, but heard. In silence, alone, at the hour between dusk and dawn, where the 13th lesson ends, and the chant begins again. Forever. One line was circled, not a hymn, but a key. The burning, then, was not simply destruction. It was containment. If there is a final voice left from Elmsbrook Seminary, a voice unfiltered, uncensored, and unintentional, it is that of Lawrence Ellery. He was neither the brightest nor most troubled of the seminarians. His name appears in no formal investigation. He left behind no family. No grave marker bears his name. But his notebook, miraculously preserved in the rectory's attic, contains the closest thing we have to a true witness account. The notebook itself is simple. Red cloth cover, stitched spine, pages yellowed with age. Inside are 143 entries, spanning from September 3, 1936, to sometime in early April 1937. Most entries are brief, unremarkable. Reflections on sermons, descriptions of the cold, mentions of food, classmates, weather. But in the final third of the book, something shifts. The tone grows urgent, disoriented. The handwriting begins to fragment. Words curl inward. Sentences spiral. Dates become inconsistent. There are days listed twice, days missing entirely, and finally, a week-long gap before the last 10 entries, which are undated, unpunctuated, and increasingly symbolic. In one entry, Ellery writes, "Today the clock moved backwards. Only I saw. Only I kept walking forward. I asked Father Vale, but he only smiled and said, "It is time for the 13th. The next entry simply reads, "They are humming again, not with mouths." Investigators at the time dismissed the notebook as the ramblings of a mentally unwell young man, the result of isolation, strict discipline, and perhaps religious mania. But later studies have revealed deeper layers. Dr. Anna Korvosky, a semiotics researcher, analyzed the final pages and found repeating sigils encoded into the margins, symbols that match the spiral geometry found on the chapel floor and in Cantus 13. She believes Ellery was subconsciously replicating an ancient system of notation. One marginal note is particularly striking. A triangle within a circle, within a square, repeatedly drawn and labeled Seder. The same diagram appears in manuscripts related to sacred geometry, often linked to ideas of recursion, time inversion, and containment. Ellery's last coherent entry reads, "There are more of us now, too many for the rooms. Some are not from here. They know the chant. I hear it in their teeth." A priest sent to analyze the notebook under the Vatican's Archivum Arcana made a singular comment in his classified report. "This is not madness. It is transcription." What then was Ellery writing down? And who or what was he copying? There's evidence Ellery was one of the students subjected to the 13th lesson. Notes found in the rector's desk list initials matched to attendance records. Beside LE is a single word, resonant. Some have theorized that Ellery, unlike the others, did not vanish because he was taken, but because he transcended, that he became the tuning fork through which the hymn, the lesson, and the geometry aligned. In a chilling twist, Ellery's notebook contains 2 full pages of what appear to be coordinates, strings of numbers, angles, dates, and star positions. When plotted together, they form a spiral overlay on the seminary's floor plan, a spiral that ends precisely beneath the burnt-out altar, where the censer and final hymn were found. Ellery was not writing to remember. He was writing to map. And some believe that by reading the notebook aloud, by retracing his words in order, you can follow the same path. Into the spiral, into the center, into the place where the chant does not echo but originates. And that is why the notebook is now sealed in a vault, wrapped in lead cloth, surrounded by salt and scripture. Not to preserve it, but to keep it quiet. It was not a fire that ended Elmsbrook Seminary. Nor was it abandonment, nor plague, nor war. The seminary was unbound, cut loose from the physical and anchored no longer by walls, ritual, or time. Those who have studied the collapse speak often of the breach. Not an explosion, not a disappearance. A point where containment failed, where the 13th lesson was no longer something taught, but something remembered by the structure itself. After the events of early April 1937, a search party sent by the diocesan authority found the chapel split open at the ceiling, not by fire, but by pressure. The roof beams had twisted outward, not inward, as if something had risen or escaped. In the cellar beneath the choir stalls, investigators found the censer, the same one used during the final chant, fused into the stone. The burn mark beneath it did not radiate like heat. It spiraled inward, the same shape seen in Ellery's notebook. Among the ruins, not a single human body was recovered. Clothes remained folded at the foot of cots. Meals, half-eaten, molded on wooden tables. Footprints led into rooms but did not emerge. Timepieces, from pocket watches to the great brass chapel clock, had stopped. Not all at once, but backwards. Each marked an earlier hour than the last. A single phonograph cylinder was discovered intact in the chapel's archive room. Labeled only 13B, it contains an audio fragment lasting 46 seconds. The sound begins as a Gregorian chant. Recognizable Latin phrases, sung by young male voices. But halfway through, the audio begins to repeat, then fracture. Layers stack. The chant loops unevenly. At second 31, a new frequency begins beneath the voices. A tone. One that does not correspond to any known scale. One that should not be audible to human ears, but is. Those who've listened to the full recording report symptoms. Dizziness, nausea, feelings of being watched, episodes of lost time. One researcher awoke 6 hours later with fresh ink on their palms. a spiral drawn in perfect symmetry, despite no memory of holding a pen. The Vatican's official response was to seal the cylinder. They encased the remains of the chapel in concrete. But the unbinding was not a localized event. In the following months, 3 other seminaries across Europe reported phenomena tied to Cantus 13. Spontaneous humming, loss of time, students speaking in unlearned tongues. One such student, a German postulant, wrote in his diary, "I saw the hymn. It had a shape, a coil of ash and light. It told me I had already sung it, and would again." There is reason to believe that the 13th lesson was never meant for Elmsbrook alone, that it was part of something older, cyclical. A chant not written by men, but uncovered, rediscovered, and each time incomplete. The sacred geometry beneath the altar at Elmsbrook contains 12 intersecting circles, each corresponding to one of the 12 original hymnals used in Catholic chant tradition. But beneath them, etched with a different hand, is a 13th ring, unnumbered, without center, the spiral, the symbol of recursion, of collapse inward, of perfect memory not forward, but backward. The unbinding was not a destruction. It was a release, a breaking of the temporal seal that held the chant in place. And once it was loose, once it echoed again, it began to search for a new seminary, a new voice, a new student ready to learn not with their ears, but with their blood. We end this chapter not with a question, but a warning. Do not sing what you do not understand. Do not follow what loops. And if ever you find a hymn book with no title, only a spiral on its cover, leave it closed, or it will remember you. The seminary is gone, but the story of Elmsbrook continues to echo, not in stone or song, but in quiet archives, in hidden corners of diocesan libraries, and in the dreams of those who were never meant to remember. In 1984, nearly 50 years after the disappearance, a low-level clerk working for the Church of England uncovered a sealed dossier labeled As.1937, Null Cantus. It contained the original floor plans of Elmsbrook Seminary, marginalia from Bishop Greaves, and a final, unsigned note scribbled on the back of a mass card. Memory is a circle. Only the naive draw lines. This note is the only known mention of the phrase Null Cantus, or the empty song. Researchers who examined the site after the concrete seal was placed discovered a strange phenomenon. Silence. Not ordinary silence, but an acoustic dead zone.
No eco, no wind resonance, no insect noise.
Microphones placed at the site recorded only low hiss, interrupted every 46 minutes by an unexplained pulse. In 1997, a BBC radio producer exploring forgotten mysteries of British religious history aired a 2-part series on Elmsbrook. The second part was abruptly pulled and never aired. Those who heard the first episode reported no disturbing content. And yet, the station received over 200 letters in 2 weeks. Most were vague. Some said they remembered the building differently. Others insisted they had attended Elmsbrook themselves, though birth records proved otherwise. One letter, sent anonymously, included a Polaroid photograph. It showed a boys' dormitory room with an open hymnal on a desk. The hymn was Ave Maris Stella, but the margins were covered in geometric drawings, the center of which was a perfectly drawn spiral. That same year, the producer vanished while hiking near Northumberland. The only item recovered was a field journal containing the phrase, "They remember better than we do." In more recent years, the Elmsbrook case has become something of an obsession in occult circles. A limited edition book titled The Spiral Choir was self-published in 2009. It claims to be based on the Ellery diary and includes what it calls a reconstruction of the 13th lesson. The melody is unremarkable, but those who hum it while alone have reported losing time or finding rearranged furniture when they emerge from trance. Of course, skeptics point to mass suggestion, a well-crafted myth embedded in an obscure corner of ecclesiastical history. But even the skeptics admit one thing: no one knows who wrote the 13th lesson. And more troubling, the melody does not match any Gregorian modes. It contains intervals forbidden in Catholic music since the Council of Trent. Which brings us back to a singular, unanswerable question. If the hymn was not written by man, who taught it to the students? The answer may lie not in the song, but in the silence that follows. Witness accounts compiled across decades describe a sensation not of terror, but of stillness, a total absence of self. An erasure. One survivor of a seminary that experienced similar phenomena in 1942 described it this way: "I was not afraid. I was simply gone. And what was left? Remembered the song, even after I forgot it." What happened at Elmsbrook was not an event, but a conversion. A migration of music from mind to matter. A place taught to remember. And if the spiral truly loops back, if time is only a chant, repeated until sung perfectly, then it may already be returning. You may already have heard it. You may have already sung it. But if you forget everything else, remember this: there was once a seminary in the English countryside. The students were devout, its chapel serene, its lessons ordinary. And then one day, they sang a hymn that was not theirs. And the building sang back. The spiral turns again. Stillness returns. And somewhere, something begins to hum. Fade to black. End credits. As the dust of Elmsbrook's mystery settles across nearly a century of quiet rumor, the last traces of its legacy lie not in buildings or books, but in patterns, in the repetition of symbols, in recitations that feel strangely familiar, in moments of déjà vu when standing in chapels you've never entered. The phrase "the 13th lesson" appears one final time, not in a diary or archival box, but in the margin of a theological dissertation written in 2012 by a Cambridge seminarian named Dorian Mace. Mace was studying cyclical liturgical time, focusing on the nonlinear structures of pre-Tridentan chants. In a footnote, he mentions an unattributed melody, heard during a silent retreat in Devon. No instructor remembered playing it. No record of its sheet music existed. And yet, for students could hum it down to the half-step. 1 year later, Mace was ordained. 6 months after that, he went missing. His final sermon, recorded by a congregant on a handheld camcorder, features a peculiar benediction. We do not exit time. We repeat it. And one day, we will all arrive where we began, singing a song we do not remember learning. When investigators cleared Mace's flat, they found a single cassette tape on his desk labeled Elmsbrook. It contained 47 minutes of ambient noise and a single spoken sentence, whispered in Latin. E silencio, Deus responde. From silence, God answers. We return then to the beginning, to the first chapel stone laid in 1869, to Bishop Greaves' sermon warning his pupils that music is not neutral, that harmony can conceal heresy, that the mouth may sing what the soul has not consented to. A prayer, after all, is not always directed outward. Sometimes it is received. The Elmsbrook Seminary no longer exists. The land was sold, paved, and repurposed. But in recent drone footage, the faint outline of the chapel floor plan is still visible beneath the tarmac, as if the earth itself remembers the cadence of its architecture. Several eyewitnesses from the nearby village of Harrogate report a strange, intermittent hum at dusk. It occurs only on Maundy Thursday. It lasts for 13 minutes. No source has ever been found. And still, the hymn persists. You may find it surfacing when you least expect. In the whir of an old projector, the spin of a vinyl record, the static between radio frequencies. You may find yourself humming something you cannot name, and then forget you did it at all. The spiral completes its turn. This is the final prayer. And it is not addressed to God. It is addressed to memory itself. Let it receive us. Let it forget us. Let it sing. They say Elmsbrook ended in 1937, that its final yearbook was never published, that the remaining books were burned, that the records were closed. But like any closed circle, what ends also begins again. In a recently declassified intelligence file dated 1952, there's a note about a MI5 operative embedded in a fringe religious gathering in Norfolk. The operation's codename was Lesson 13. The file mentions a chapel, 12 initiates, and a doctrine of musical recursion. Though the report is heavily redacted, one line remains clear. Identical iconography to Elmsbrook Seminary, Case File 1937. Recommend suppression. In 1979, a musicology professor in Oslo publishes a short article in a Scandinavian folklore journal. He claims to have reconstructed a hymn once sung in English seminaries before the war. The melody, nearly identical to the ambient frequencies recorded on the Mace cassette. The article receives no citations. The professor, Anund Thorsen, dies the following year of unknown causes. His personal collection is missing. In 1996, a London-based experimental theater group performs a live audiovisual show titled The 13th Lesson inside an abandoned Victorian hospital. Attendees report strange aftereffects, disorientation, nosebleeds, and in one case, temporary muteness. Local papers blame strobe lights, but the show is shut down and never repeated. The group dissolves within months. In 2020, an anonymous video titled Elmsbrook_0001 appears on a deep web archive forum. It's a single shot, a basement filled with burnt books. In the background, a metronome ticks. Every 13 beats, it stops. A whisper says, "Begin again," and then it does. Today, whispers of Elmsbrook's legacy continue. In theological circles, in academic footnotes, in the dreams of those who never heard the hymn but wake with the tune in their head. Perhaps the seminary never truly vanished. Perhaps it replicated, like a pattern in sacred geometry, folding over itself in secret, in buildings with no listed architects, in liturgies that do not belong to any denomination, in choirs that practice for services never scheduled. The circle remains, and like all sacred loops, it waits, not for discovery, but for participation.